So I regret to announce that Tom Hayden can't be with us here in person today. For those of you who may not know, on May 22nd, Tom had a stroke. He was reporting on fracking in Kern County from the front lines of fracking, where the air is incredibly toxic, and he suddenly felt poorly, and they rushed him to the hospital right away in LA. The good news is that Tom is strong, clear, and committed to making a full recovery. And I spoke with him again just a few days ago, and to be honest, it's still really hard to even keep up with him. He is just cranking it out. And he sends his very, very warmest regards to all of us here at Bioneers. He first spoke in 1991, the second year of the conference, and is really part of our family. Instead, what we're going to do is to show an excerpt of a talk that Tom gave last year at the Climate Leadership Intensive that we co-organized with him. And it was an extraordinary moment, the closing, where for about half an hour he just dropped wisdom. And it's really a transmission about movement building. And the full talk is online. If you want to see all of it, we could only show you a portion, but it's really, we think, very extraordinary. He also sent in another video communication, but we had some technical problems with it, so we didn't want to show it here on the big screen, but it will be posted online, and you can find that, and I certainly encourage you to look for that. Let me just say a few words about Tom. He's truly one of our great wise elders. He's never stopped making change since he first burst on the scene in the 1960s as one of the most powerful and effective leaders our movement has ever known. From the conjunction of his early civil rights work in the South to co-founding SDS in 1961, Students for a Democratic Society, from his writing of most of the iconic 1962 Port Huron statement that galvanized the entire student movement, through the tumultuous years of the anti-Vietnam War movement and his remarkable legislative achievements in 18 years in the California legislature, Tom is arguably the one leader from the New Left in the 60s who went on to have an illustrious and incredibly impactful role in the nation's political life ever since. Beginning in the 70s, combining his commitment to the environment and to social justice, Tom served as Jerry Brown's first solar energy chairman, and at the same time was the California delegate to federal commissions on energy and Southwest border development. He led California's first solar and conservation laws as a state legislator. He's worked tirelessly for peace while pushing for a clean energy economy. The Sacramento Press Corps called him the conscience of the Senate. When Jerry Brown returned for a second term as governor, Tom again joined the struggle for climate justice as a journalist, advisor to environmental groups, and advocate in the halls of the state Senate and with Governor Brown's advisors. He's focused on building California's clean energy economy as a national and global model. He helped advance California's groundbreaking climate justice policy and gaining funding of billions of dollars for that. Growing out of the Bioneers Climate Intensive last year, Tom and other participants devised a plan to pass a very far-reaching climate agenda for the upcoming UN summit in Paris. Tom is calling for green blocks of cities and states and regions to align around the world with California's leading-edge standards and game-changing environmental justice policies. Tom's most recent achievement was the historic coal divestment law signed just weeks ago. He got the idea from student activists, including Katie Hoffman, drafted the outline for Senator Kevin De Leon, and worked to gain bipartisan passage against all odds and despite having just suffered his stroke. Tom recently had to decline an amazing invitation to be at the White House with Pope Francis and the President. The author and editor of 20 books, Tom's finishing the first draft of his latest book right now, The Forgotten Power of the Vietnam Protest Movement, and told me he's ahead of schedule, which is frightening. Tom Hayden's got soul. He's never stopped being a leading voice for peace, justice, protecting the environment, and reforming politics. He remains among our greatest visionary leaders and change-making activists. So here, please join me in enjoying Tom's talk from last year. Thank you.
I was born at a moment that the New Deal saved my family. It was before and during my birth and my first 2 or 3 years that this happened. So I can only go back and listen to people and ask what happened. What happened is that my grandfather died in a cannery accident, the fault of the Carnation Milk Company in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He fell in a vat and was chopped up. He left my grandma with 11 kids. And this was during the Depression. And she survived during the Depression and took care of those kids. And during that time, she was sustained by a $5,000 check from the company with regret for the death of her husband. There was no pension, there was no Social Security, there were no rights of organized labor. Her world fell apart in the late 20s, early 30s. I don't remember all that much about her, but I remember her as being sort of the quintessential nanny, you know, the grandmother, and all these kids. And what they were doing in the Depression was huddling up together like students do today, 5 to an apartment who don't know each other, but living through a semester at NYU or wherever. And they were selling apples, and they were doing odd jobs together and pooling what little they made every day in order to buy food and pay the bills to get to the next day. They were not political. This is a key point in my sharing with you, that I believe with C. Wright Mills that we have to reach people who are in their personal milieu, and their problem is that they're detached from history and social structure. They don't know what has happened to them. They are in a catastrophe, and they are prone, if they're working people, to think there's something wrong with them, their ethnicity, their class, their lack of education. They're not prone to automatically blame an outside aggressor. That would take a level of pride and insolence and insubordination, so to speak, a mutinous mentality that they don't have. They're survivors, and they know a lot. I'm not saying they lack knowledge. They know a lot. I learned that, too, after leaving the university and going to Mississippi and Georgia and Newark, that poor people know a lot that middle-class people do not know unless they come from that background. But anyway, in the middle of this process of the collapse of capitalism, the collapse of what government we had, there were the stirrings of the New Deal. There were social movements, Communist Party led, organizing drives in manufacturing plants, got nowhere. People got fired, got clubbed down, beat up, shot. Anarchists tried to do it in their horizontal way, to borrow the current language of the current movement. Trotskyists kept attacking everyone on both sides for not following the correct line. Farmers, I don't remember if they picked up pitchforks, but they went to work against the banks and the Grange, and they started a period of turbulent working class expression and middle class expression at having been sold out by somebody. And it started with finding ways to make enough food to eat, and it ended up with doing everything possible to obstruct the business as usual of the times unless they were fed, unless their children were fed, unless they could go to school, unless there was somebody to say that there was hope on the horizon. to borrow a more recent phrase. And I remember my mom went through this, you know, the orphan of father she hardly knew. And when I was growing up at the end of the 30s and the beginning of the Great War, I remember sitting on her lap a lot, and she'd always talk to me about how she loved Roosevelt. And I didn't know who Roosevelt was. I just thought, Roosevelt, that's God. My mother loves God, and Roosevelt is taking care of us. She would keep saying that. Because by that time, after these revolutionary inciting of working people and average everyday people, they had achieved social security. And I can't tell you what that would mean for my mother when she's thinking about Grandpa. They achieved bargaining rights for organized labor, unheard of, seemingly impossible. They achieved pensions and all the rest of it. And they had achieved what was known as the New Deal, but at the time it was being built, they did not call it the New Deal. They called it the movement. It didn't have a name. They didn't announce, now we are starting a movement for a New Deal. What happened was this strange mix of a revolutionary impulse on the one hand, a liberal impulse from do-gooders who wanted a better government second, people in the center who were very frightened at the possibility of social disorder and were timid about raising their head, and then people on the right, like my priest, Father Charles Coughlin, who was busy organizing an anti-Semitic response to the very same conditions, and working closely with Henry Ford on the idea of a new Nazi party based in my hometown of Royal Oak or Hamtramck. The people on the far right thought Roosevelt was a communist. I don't remember if they questioned his birth. But he was leading us to a Soviet America. The people on the left, some of the people on the left thought that was a great idea, Soviet America. They were in little discussion circles constantly reading textbooks from Marx and Engels about the future of Soviet America. Most people that I would identify with were organizers. They were selfless people who didn't work for much money, didn't think far ahead to the careers that they would hold as future labor bureaucrats or Democratic Party administrators. They wanted to know if they'd have their heads crushed by a policeman's baton, and they were willing to do that. There's sort of a lost generation there in history. And there was another group, maybe a little like some people you know are the scientists today in climate science. They were known as the brain trust of the New Deal. And they were a very eclectic group of people who were brainy, intellectuals. And they were probably in the most important American tradition that I've ever studied, and I consider myself part of, the American pragmatic tradition. And I know that pragmatism is now a dirty word, but if you look under it, it means listen first, see how far people are willing to go, and improvise a step forward, a program that will take you a little bit towards survival or a little bit towards a better life as rapidly as you can. The New Deal Brain Trust invented all these amazing programs. One parallel today would be like if somebody said, we need a renewables work administration, like the NRA. We need to put every person in this country and on this planet who's out of a job or underemployed into a great employment project, publicly funded, privately funded, but it has to happen because there's a great work to be done. The great work is to save us from the Depression in those days. The great work today is to save us from climate catastrophe and the end of civilization as we know it. No one had that idea in 1929. They were gripped with that idea by 1937. The whole idea of industrial workers being organized, the whole idea of old age pensions, of doing something about the Buddhist lament that life is all about suffering, delivering people Social Security, having to sit at a table and argue about whether we can also do health care, being told by the president, we don't have the votes, we can't do that. Some future generation will fight for health care. That's how the New Deal was pounded out. It was improvised by very creative people who dared to take it on and who simply believed that their current lives were unlivable. And they didn't have to be poor to know that. It was just an unlivable situation with fascism approaching over here and with depression never seeming to end. And out of that pragmatic determination, they decided the government has got to hire people, the government has got to protect people, the government is what saved my mother and why she loved Franklin Roosevelt. And it was a close call. You know, we could have gone to the right, we could have gone into chaos, and the answer to what might have happened we'll never know, because then came World War II, and everybody thought problem solved. Everybody's working down the street in the empty plant, they're building planes and tanks and trucks and jeeps and cars. The car industry was formed out of that experience. My father went to work as an accountant for a car company. Detroit was booming. My mother loved Roosevelt for those reasons, not ideological. And when we come to that point when people are unable to be trapped in ideology but are willing to do what works, that's the time when I think we'll have the equivalent of a New Deal for the climate catastrophe. So there were people who said, okay, we're going to invest in the rebuilding of America and after the war in a Marshall Plan for the world. And they cut a deal without a handshake, as far as I know, but the capitalist class, the finance capitalists, divided over whether they thought that their obligation was to reform the system in order to stabilize their profit, or crack down on these insurgents and stop them in their tracks and go all the way to drive them off the political map towards God knows what kind of system we would have had. On the other hand, you had labor and social movements and populist movements where the argument was, should we take the right to collective bargaining or go all the way to socialism? It was kind of like 1919, and I was there too, when the socialists told the suffragettes, all the way with socialism first, then you women will get your right to vote. And the women said, not taking that offer, thank you very much. Some of us are socialists, some are not, but we want the right to vote. My sense is the most we're going to accomplish here, which is quite a lot when you think of the state of the planet, is a global Green New Deal. But somebody has to cut a deal because unless you believe that we have to have revolution first and then save the planet, if you believe that, I advise you to listen. Just go to meetings in your community, in your PTA, in your neighborhood, and ask, get up actually and say, I want a revolution first, what do you people think? And you'll see that they're not there now. They might be thinking about it, but it's a simple fact that we need to have this green infrastructure, this green bank that the previous panel was talking about, a green financing mechanism, and at the same time, just as labor needed to be organized and respected in their dignity, we need all the people of color, the disenfranchised communities of California, to feel that they have been invited to the table and that they're going to get somewhere, that this is not another talk session. We have precious little time to get there, but we know from the science that it is inevitable that things will get worse, and it's also, to me, inevitable from my experience that people will fight back. And it's all one step at a time. The starting point, I think, is to combine the notions of reducing emissions and achieving jobs and environmental justice. The finance capitalists will have to accept the jobs argument, the empowerment of poor people. That's not in their normal picture. The environmental justice advocates will have to convince themselves that this emissions catastrophe is really real and is really going to wipe us out, and that we have 5 or 10 years to get through it as safely as we can. You know, if you read Thoreau's book that was published after his life, The Dispersion of Seeds, which is a book that kind of is a gospel for Bioneers, it's about the growth of communities and the rise of new generations. And at one point, Thoreau says, and I'm quoting, "We find ourselves in a world that is already planted, but is also being planted as at first." That's the transition we're in. That's the planting and cultivating that we're doing. And we see in these panels, we see in these slideshows, these PowerPoint presentations, a new world rising that has been cultivated, but is again being planted as at first. And what Thoreau said was he had faith. The title of his essay was, "I have faith in a seed, so do I."
So I just want to say, if you haven't already given all your money to Bioneers this morning, and to our youth, Tom Hayden has never been paid more than 2 nickels for any of his advocacy or work of this nature, not from an environmental group, not from politicians, nobody. Like many of us, he's facing rising medical costs now, and really could use some help. He's always pitched in for us. So I would like us all to pitch in for Tom too, and there's information about how to do that here. So let's give it up for Tom.